In a peaceful suburban home, where daily life unfolded in seemingly normal ways, a disturbing undercurrent was about to erupt, shattering the calm facade of an ordinary family. Sydney Powell and her mother, Brenda, seemed to have a warm and affectionate relationship, but beneath this veneer, tensions were rising. What started as minor issues escalated into an unimaginable nightmare when Sydney, in a moment of unfathomable rage, attacked her mother with a frying pan to death. Hi friends, welcome back to our channel. Today we have another interesting story of Sydney Powell, the 19-year-old college student who killed her mom with a frying pan. But before I continue, please subscribe and smash the like button as it encourages us to make more interesting stories just like this. Sydney Powell's life seemed to be on a promising trajectory as she began her college journey. Her first semester at Mount Union University, just an hour away from her hometown of Akron, Ohio, was marked by success and new beginnings. Sydney had thrived academically in high school, which earned her a scholarship to Mount Union, and she entered college with high expectations and excitement. She lived with her best friend, Lauren, from high school, which provided a comforting sense of familiarity in her new environment. In the beginning, Sydney's transition to university life was smooth. She quickly adapted to the academic demands and social opportunities, joining a sorority and engaging with new peers. Her friends described her as initially shy but warm once she got to know people. She seemed to embrace this new journey wholeheartedly. However, as the semesters passed, cracks began to appear in her seemingly flawless college experience. Despite her initial success, Sydney struggled academically during her sophomore year. By the end of the autumn semester of 2019, it became clear that Sydney was having significant difficulties. She failed 3 out of her 4 courses, a serious blow given her previously strong academic record. In December 2019, Sydney was placed on academic suspension. This suspension was not a permanent expulsion but rather a temporary halt in her studies, with the opportunity to return and prove herself in the following semester. The process involved receiving a formal notice from the university, which required her signature and return to confirm her acknowledgement and intention to either address the issues or accept the suspension. However, Sydney's reaction to this suspension was peculiar. Instead of addressing the suspension directly or seeking help, she continued to live at the college as if nothing had changed. She maintained her usual routine, attending classes, participating in sorority events, and socializing with friends. Sydney's parents were unaware of the gravity of her academic troubles. Brenda Powell, Sydney's mother, had been closely involved in her daughter's life, supporting her through high school and maintaining a close relationship with her. Brenda and her husband, Steve, were proud of Sydney's academic achievements and had no reason to suspect any issues. This belief was reinforced by Sydney's assurances that everything was fine. The turning point came when Steve Powell attempted to log into the university's online portal to pay Sydney's tuition fees in January 2020. He was met with an error that prevented him from accessing the account. Despite repeated attempts and assurances from Sydney that the issue would be resolved, the problem persisted. After a month of unresolved issues, Steve contacted the university administration directly, only to discover that Sydney was no longer enrolled at Mount Union. The revelation was shocking and deeply concerning. The university administration's response was unhelpful as they informed Steve that the reasons for Sydney's academic status were private and could only be discussed with Sydney herself. This left Steve in a state of confusion and worry, unsure of how to proceed or what had caused Sydney to leave school abruptly. The academic suspension, while serious, did not have to mark the end of Sydney's college career. She had the option to return, address her academic shortcomings, and continue her education. However, the decision to ignore the suspension notice and continue her college life without addressing the issues hinted at a troubling and complex situation. Sydney's behavior during this period of suspension raised several questions. The situation was clearly against school policy, and Sydney soon found herself before the administrative board. Initially, the university appeared sympathetic to her predicament, understanding that a student might struggle to adapt to their new circumstances. To offer further support, the administration even proposed assisting Sydney in informing her parents. Instead, she deceived the board, falsely claiming her parents were aware of her suspension, but were on an extended vacation and thus unavailable to help her move out of her dormitory. After several meetings, Sydney was required to vacate her dormitory on February 24th. Avoiding her parents, she took refuge in nearby motels until March 3rd. It was then that her father, Steve, uncovered her deception. Disturbed by the discovery, Steve ended the call and checked Sydney's location using a family tracking app, which revealed she had returned to the family home. He immediately contacted his wife, Brenda, to discuss the troubling news. Both Steve and Brenda were deeply upset. Their daughter had not only failed out of college but had also been dishonest about it for weeks. Instead of reacting with anger, Steve asked Brenda to meet him at home after her work shift to discuss Sydney's situation. To keep his arrival unnoticed, Steve left his phone at the office and drove home, reaching there shortly after 11:30. When confronted, Sydney broke down and confessed her feelings of inadequacy compared to her peers, who seemed to have clear goals and successes. Overwhelmed by self-doubt, she felt like a failure. Steve reassured her of her worth and suggested they work together to set things right. After advising Sydney to talk to her mother when she returned, Steve headed back to his office. At work, Steve received a text message from Brenda, who had left work early and arrived home around 12:15 p.m., 26 minutes later. At 12:41 p.m., Steve responded, asking, "What did you discuss with Sydney?" Unfortunately, he never received a reply. Just 10 minutes later, Steve got a phone call from a friend who was a detective with the local police department. The detective asked if everything was all right, mentioning that officers had just been dispatched to the Powell residence, indicating something was wrong. At that moment, unbeknownst to Steve and the police, Brenda had just entered the family home to speak with her daughter. She was on the phone with the Student Relations Department at Mount Union. While staff members were speaking with Brenda, they suddenly heard a loud argument and alarming sounds. A series of screams were heard, followed by several thuds and a loud crashing noise. Then the phone line went dead. Steve, oblivious to the severity of the situation, started to panic. He had been at the property only an hour before, and now, with growing concern, he was desperately trying to reach both his wife and daughter. It took several tries before Sydney finally picked up, her voice trembling with fear. She told him, in a shaky whisper, that someone had broken into their house. Kenneth and the other officers arrived at the scene on Scudder Drive shortly after. What they found was a house in shambles. Windows were shattered, overturned furniture, and blood throughout the house. Sydney was found outside, visibly shaken and with blood on her hands. She described the break-in during a conversation with her mother, followed by the stabbing of her mother multiple times. Brenda was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead on arrival. The crime scene investigation uncovered a series of troubling details. The autopsy confirmed that Brenda had died from blunt force trauma to the head, caused by a heavy object, a bloodied frying pan found in the kitchen. The medical examiner estimated her death occurred 1 to 2 hours before the police arrived, judging by the body's temperature and the onset of rigor mortis. Defensive wounds on Brenda's arms and hands suggested she fought back, though there were no signs of forced entry, implying that her assailant was either known to her or had entered through an unlocked door. The toxicology report showed no substances in Brenda's system, ruling out intoxication as a factor in the incident. The forensic analysis of the frying pan, stained with Brenda's blood and hair, confirmed it as the murder weapon, indicating a violent struggle and raising questions about the attacker's identity and motive. As the investigation progressed, Brenda's daughter, Sydney Powell, became a person of interest. Her initial statements to the police were inconsistent. She first claimed to have been alone in her room during a supposed break-in but later mentioned overhearing an argument between her mother and an unknown individual. These inconsistencies, along with forensic evidence, began to cast suspicion on her. Traces of Brenda's blood were found on Sydney's clothing, which she struggled to explain, contradicting her claim of not being near her mother during the incident. The lack of forced entry and Sydney's conflicting alibi, supported by discrepancies in phone records and surveillance footage, further deepened the suspicion. With this mounting evidence, law enforcement obtained a warrant and arrested Sydney at her home. As Sydney was taken into custody, the investigation continued, focusing on both the physical evidence and the possible psychological motives behind the tragic event. Facing charges of murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence, Sydney's plea was altered to not guilty by reason of insanity, causing delays as a second medical evaluation was requested. Despite the grim nature of the crime, Sydney's family maintained their support, believing she had acted under a mental health crisis. Her trial, beginning on September 7, 2023, involved testimonies from various witnesses, including her teacher, university staff, and mental health professionals. During Sydney Powell's trial, the courtroom became a battleground for opposing narratives, each side presenting their case with intense scrutiny. Her defense team argued that Sydney had been suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia, which led her to a psychotic break and ultimately to the brutal killing of her mother. They emphasized that the violence was entirely out of character for Sydney, asserting that her behavior was not indicative of someone in a sane state of mind. The defense highlighted the lack of a clear motive and argued that the severity of the crime reflected a mental health crisis rather than premeditated malice. In contrast, the prosecution presented a starkly different perspective. They contended that Sydney was fully aware of her actions during the murder. They pointed to her efforts to cover up the crime scene and her attempts to impersonate her mother on the phone as clear indications of her intention to mislead the investigation. The prosecution argued that these actions were consistent with someone attempting to evade responsibility, not someone suffering from a psychotic break. Steve Powell, Sydney's father, took the stand and detailed the events leading up to the tragic incident. His testimony painted a picture of a daughter who had recently faced academic and emotional turmoil, yet he struggled to reconcile this with the heinous act she was accused of committing. Friends and colleagues of Brenda Powell, Sydney's mother, also took the stand, expressing shock at the murder and recounting the close and loving relationship they believed Brenda and Sydney shared. Mount Union officials provided crucial testimony, recounting that they had heard disturbing noises, thuds, and screams during a phone call with Brenda Powell. This evidence suggested that the attack on Brenda was ongoing while she was still engaged in conversation, adding a chilling layer to the case. A friend and co-worker of Brenda, identified as Fraser, testified that the call ended abruptly, and subsequent attempts to reach Brenda led to Sydney answering the phone and pretending to be her mother. This testimony was pivotal in illustrating the prosecution's claim that Sydney was deliberately misleading others. Sydney's roommate and close friend, Lauren, also took the stand. She described Sydney as having appeared normal and cheerful just days before the murder. Lauren's testimony, asserting that Sydney had no apparent issues with her mother and had been in good spirits, was intended to challenge the defense's argument of a sudden and severe mental health decline. The trial's subsequent days focused intensely on Sydney's mental state at the time of the murder. Several psychologists were called to offer their opinions. Dr. Swale testified that Sydney was experiencing an acute psychotic episode and diagnosed her with bipolar-type schizoaffective disorder. Dr. Swale's testimony supported the defense's claim that Sydney was not in control of her actions due to a severe mental health crisis. Dr. Ridden, who had evaluated Sydney in 2021, corroborated this perspective, noting that the brutality and lack of motive in the attack were consistent with someone undergoing a psychotic break. Conversely, Dr. Sylvia Abradovich, a clinical psychologist, argued that Sydney might have been exaggerating her mental illness to escape accountability. She pointed out that Sydney's reported symptoms from as early as age 11 would be exceptionally rare for schizophrenia, which typically manifests in women in their mid to late 20s. Dr. Abradovich's assessment suggested that the evidence did not align with a genuine schizophrenic episode. After 9 hours and 23 minutes of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict on September 20, 2023. They found Sydney Powell guilty on all counts: murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. 1 week later, on September 28th, Sydney was sentenced. For the murder charge, she received an indefinite term of 15 years to life in prison. On the charge of tampering with evidence, she was sentenced to an additional 3 years, with both sentences running concurrently. The public reaction to the trial was mixed, with many expressing outrage at Sydney's family for their continued support. Despite the gravity of the charges, Sydney's family maintained their belief in her mental instability and supported her throughout the trial. This support sparked debate among observers, who found it challenging to form a clear opinion given the complexity of Sydney's mental state and the severity of her actions. What are your thoughts on this? Let's engage in the comments, and please don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories like this. Thanks for watching, and until our next episode, bye-bye.